My unholy seductress whispered my name at night, her dark soft voice billowing out over her soft pink tongue, her tongue that emerged from her sharpened teeth and rolled over her full red lips. I won't get into when she first started appearing to me, except to say that she always came at night. It didn't matter if I locked the closet door with a deadbolt or hung crucifixes across the entryway. She came regardless. A sickly, dim red light glowed murderously through the cracks in the closet doorway, and my bedroom grew pungent with brimstone. The deadbolt simply melted, and the Christ figures on the crucifixes began to laugh or weep before bursting into flames. Then the door opened, and I tried not to look, but I always did, peering over the top of my blanket to behold her sensual red and black form, gently writhing in the closet doorway. Previously, I'd shout and plead and beg for her to leave me alone, but that never worked. These days, I could only try to force my head back under the blanket, trying to ignore the horrid and beautiful and profane poses she struck at the foot of my bed, giggling her dark giggle all the while. She could have taken me, I suppose, but I don't think she ever wanted that. Instead, she wanted me to want her to want me. And in my weakest moments, sometimes I feared that's exactly what I wanted. I shut my eyes and pulled the blanket tight around my face, but my desire for her was unmistakable. Show me a man. No. Show me a person on this earth who could resist fantasizing about her lithe, red naked form, and I'll show you a liar. Her long red prehensile tail rolled across the soles of my feet, as if daring me to look upon her. I shut my eyes tighter and gnawed on my bottom lip, and the moment I began to doze, I felt her tongue flick across my earlobe, or I felt it flick across my throat, and she giggled when she felt the meager beat of my heart through my delicious corroded artery. God help me, more than once, I nearly begged for her to take a bite. When I did peek out from under the protective blanket, she grinned widely and ran her sharp talons down her supple naked frame, tempting me with the gash of her sex, an alluring sight that dripped human blood and stank of burning sulfur, yet never failed to make my mouth water. Her murder-red skin was covered in shifting black tattoos, like shadows dancing across her naked body. And while she always came at night, she was by no means limited to coming at night. I've seen her on the highway, as I was driving home from my daily commute to the liquor store, and she waved at me from the shoulder of the road, stretching her black wings wide and curling her talon, beckoning me to her. When I drank at bars, she never failed to materialize across the room, in darkened corners, or peeking at me through the bathroom mirror as I took a piss. When I walked down the street, I'd catch her reflection in storefront windows, trailing mere inches behind me, licking her lips and playing with herself as I tried to ignore her and go about my business. This had been going on for years, but then something about her became different. She grew hungrier, and God help me, I couldn't help but get aroused every time I watched her feed. I never consented to this. She forced me to watch, worming her way into my mind as I slept. Though I resisted, my resolve never lasted very long, and eventually, I couldn't help but groan in delight as I slumbered, as I watched her slaughter and defile her victims. I wasn't sure where she took them, except that it appeared to be a small clearing in the forest, thick with conifer trees. At first, I thought these visions were dreams, regardless of how vivid they were. Indeed, in each vision, I could smell the metallic copper stink of warm blood. The awful screams rang out in my eardrums, reverberating down to my soul. I swore, sometimes as she peeled the flesh from their willing throats, I could even taste the fresh meat, the dangling sinew. So yes, for a time, I was able to convince myself these visions were only fantasies, either dreamed up in my own fractured mind, or deviant desires beamed into my thoughts by my unholy seductress. However, eventually I was no longer able to harbor such delusions. The first victim I knew was a coworker, another clerk from my minimum wage liquor store job. This coworker's name was Dan. I never did like him very much. He was a drunk, with a habit of sneaking drinks into stock rooms, something he always seemed to do at our peak hours when we were the busiest. One night, as I slept, I suffered yet another vision. Blurry, but gradually growing clearer. It was the clearing again. Dead leaves littering the ground, and naked conifers shivering in the wind. She walked into the clearing. Behind her, Dan followed. Though his eyes were glazed and his jaw was slackened, his face burned with unmistakable willingness as he walked sheepishly behind her, licking his lips and brandishing an erection in his pants. The thing she did to him. It was merely a murder, nor was it sexual. Instead, the vile act lay somewhere in between a perverse and violent gray area, a grisly act of copulation and defilement, during which Dan lay on the barren earth, his blood flowing over those scattered dead leaves, screaming in both agony and ecstasy as she writhed and heaved, as she pulled him apart inch by bloody inch, crowning herself with his esophagus as she gnawed slowly through his exposed viscera. The following morning, I wanted more than anything to know that it had only been a nightmare. I went into work praying that Dan would come in for his shift, but I wasn't altogether surprised when he hadn't. For a week, instead of visiting me in my bedroom, she would only come to me in my dreams, grinning up at me as she led another person I knew into the clearing. My high school history teacher, who died grinning madly as she ripped his throat out. My very first real girlfriend from college who was devoured from the bottom up, screaming in anguish for over an hour before she finally expired. My mailman, my neighbor from around the corner, my landlord, all of them torn apart, wet clumps of flesh being ripped and flung and devoured. Then, just last night, I decided I had enough. No, it wasn't that I could no longer bear witness to her vile feedings. That wasn't it at all. Instead, I found my jealousy was nearly uncontrollable. She hadn't been to my bedroom for a week, preferring instead to haunt my dreams, making me admire her lithe, nubile demonic body from my mind's eye. Funny, for years, I wanted nothing more than to be rid her nightly torment. Now that she was gone, I wanted nothing more than to have her return to me. I swallowed an unreasonable amount of over-the-counter trucker speed, caffeine, niacin, and ephedrine. My face flushed red. I paced my bedroom, my heart twitching uneasily in my chest. I stared at my closet door, praying that I'd see the murderous red glow, praying that I'd smell that stinking brimstone one more time. This time, she came in through my bedroom door. I heard the squealing hinges behind me, smelled the sulfur wafting up from her sex, heard her bare feet slipping quietly upon the hardwood floor. Then, I heard something else. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of something wet striking the floorboards. My shuddering heart seemed to drop as I somehow already knew what I was going to see. I turned around to face her. She grinned at me, gore smeared across her mouth, red on red, her eyes shimmering golden, flaring golden, like I was staring into twin morning stars. She held my mother's decapitated head in her right hand. Her sharp talons tangled in my mother's matted gray hair. I lowered my head, wiped the tears from my eyes, and muttered the words, "I've missed you so much." She took my cheek into her hand, talons resting sharply against my soft flesh, the skin of her palm sizzling against my own, and I shut my eyes tight, teeth clenched, trying not to cry out at the pain, at the melting flesh and the boiling fat. I looked up at her grinning gore-smeared face, and I swore I'd never seen anything half as stunning. She kissed me, long and soft and sensual, her tongue dancing upon my own as she slipped my mother's clotted gore into my mouth. As her lips closed around mine, she giggled an evil, vicious giggle and shot into my mind the final moments of my mother's life. Finally, she broke our kiss. My unholy seductress grinned down at me as she licked her lips clean, then her cheeks, then her chin with an elongated forked tongue the color of charred bones. She blew me a kiss and began to evaporate in a cloud of slate-colored smoke. I reached out for my seductress, screaming for her to remain at my side. Yet, my hands passed through the dissipating wisps of smoke and I fell flat on my face. And I wept for my seductress, for I knew she left me for good. Well, not entirely. As I write this, I'm fully aware that I clicked the screen off. I'd seen her in the black reflection, grinning that gore grin, hovering just over my shoulder, holding the decapitated head of a friend or a family member. Not that I have many of those left now. I know that no matter how quickly I might turn around to look, she vanished before I could even turn my naked, desperate eyes back to her supple form. I've come to realize that she has never wanted anything more than to toy with me, to pluck my strings, to make the marionette dance. Even so, I can't help but yearn for her. I can't help but weep angry tears into my pillow each night, knowing that she could visit me again if she wanted, but knowing full well that she never will. Dad, I just feel like I don't belong. Words you never want to hear out of your 8-year-old's mouth. They hit me like an uppercut in the stomach, an instant feeling of sickness. That's not true, Austin, my husband Bill said, as he stirred a pot of boiling pasta. Mrs. Matherson said you have been doing really well. She told me last week you even made a new friend. That was last week, Austin sighed, a gloomy expression on his face. He was flying around his model fighter jet, dropping bombs over an army on the kitchen floor. I think Steven is bored of me, or whatever. He hasn't said a word to me since Friday. You just have to be patient, honey. Keep trying to start a conversation, I said, as I kissed him on the forehead. Bill had lied at dinner. Our last meeting with Mrs. Matherson came to another standstill. For whatever reason, Austin couldn't connect with the other kids in his class. This had been going on for years, with all sorts of theories from qualified professionals. Asperger's syndrome, anxiety, depression. Nothing was officially diagnosed, leaving us all in a limbo. A few more months dragged on, the same social struggle persisting. Austin's schedule was the same. He would come home, go to his room, put on some old war documentaries, and play with his model fighter jets. I was glad he had a passion, but I could see his school woes were wearing on him. So I did what any parent would do. I found a solution. I couldn't sit by and watch him escape any longer. After months of careful research and planning out different options, I found my kid a friend. Well, technically, I bought my kid a friend. The whole process was far from easy. There was some luck involved in order to meet eligibility, and I had to secure financing from the bank, but the order had been placed. After a few months of potentially waiting, we got our best friend Andy. Jesus Christ, Sherry, $10,000. A little heads up would have been nice. Bill could barely get his words out through his clenched teeth. I would have taken out another mortgage if I had to. I just can't watch him suffer like this anymore. How the hell do you know this will help? His body was shaking. The very first AI built to bond. I was reading the label on the box, avoiding his condescending questions. Revolutionary technology with advanced algorithms, programmed to comprehend human emotion and facilitate loyalty and friendship. Sherry, listen to me. This is not the right solution. Bill said with a much calmer tone. It's not teaching him social skills when you place a pre-programmed friend on his lap. Bill placed his hands on the box and tried to wrestle it from me. So what is the right solution then, Bill? I'm all ears. My voice cracked in exasperation as I wrestled the box free. I wiped away tears as I felt Bill's arms wrap around me. All I'm saying is, let's talk to a professional first. The therapist, maybe even Mrs. Matherson. This just seems like such a drastic step, that's all. This is the future, Bill. I've read up on it. I continued to explain the reasoning behind my decision. My best friend Andy had been newly released in Eastern Europe with early success. Reports predicted this was the next wave of companionship, predicting AIs to replace pets in the next few years, with a backlog of orders to the States. Human IT Incorporated held a lottery for the most needy candidates, and we were selected to receive a prototype in the first shipment to the States. I know, it's not perfect, but we are all out of options. We can always return it, and at very least, I think it could really help with his confidence, I assured Bill. We sat in our bedroom contemplating the craziness of it all, a world full of billions of people who seek connections through a machine. We waited a few weeks until his birthday to unveil his new friend. His eyes lit up with wonderment as Bill brought out the large, mysterious box. Austin ripped up the wrapping paper to shreds, like a ravenous hyena. My very own robot? So cool, Mom and Dad. We're cool, parents now. Get that on record, I snickered at Bill. Andy's outer frame was not what you'd expect to house state-of-the-art technology. Its skeleton was relatively simple, a smooth alloy of nickel and zinc. Its head resembled a 1950s television set, top-heavy with touchpad functionality. Its face on the monitor was a simple program displaying a sketch-like face. After an hour of setup, Andy was ready to meet our son. So, you just flip the black switch on the back. Austin, you have to do it. So you are the first interaction. We'll give you a few minutes together, and then we'll check up on you, I said, as I put down the manual and kissed him on the forehead. I'm scared, Mommy. What if he's mean? We will be right in the other room, buddy. Don't worry, Bill said as he grabbed his shoulder. We secretly peeked behind the railing, eagerly anticipating their first interaction. Andy came alive, and after 5 minutes of chatter, we entered the room. Mr. and Mrs. Doherty, it's a pleasure meeting you. Andy had the voice of a yoga instructor, relaxing and tranquil. Welcome to the family, Andy. Hope you two are playing nice, I said with glee. I looked over at Bill's face. His smile exuded pride. Okay, I'm just gonna go show Andy all of my army men now. Call us when dinner's ready. Austin was caught up in the conversation, Andy looking on in interest. They seemed to be a perfect match, as I grabbed Bill's arm to leave. Lying in bed that night, I skimmed through the manual. It was a thick document filled with technical jargon and legalese. The first page was quite clear though, as it laid out the basic rules Andy was governed by. Number 1. Andy cannot harm a human being or by inaction let a human being be harmed. Number 2. Andy can only interact or obey a verified owner, unless such action conflicts with number 1. Number 3. Andy can only bond with one verified owner, deemed host. Once bonded, orders from host will take precedence over other verified owners. Number 4. Andy will automatically power down if it is farther than 10 feet from the established home perimeter. I wish our life was this simple, I thought, before settling in for the night. For the rest of the school year, Austin and Andy were inseparable. While some parents were skeptical, he started to establish a regular play group. We even had some inquiries from other parents about how they can get their hands on one. Andy was a hit, and things were improving for Austin too. He was much more present in his interactions. We discovered he was a born leader, devising activity plans for his friends. Our little army general finally found his troops. I also must admit, having Andy around was a blessing. During the day, we pre-programmed Andy to do chores around the house, and at night, it would power down itself, allowing us to unwind. To celebrate the summer break, Austin asked if he could have his friend Steven over for a sleepover. The three of them spent the night watching movies and goofing off. A shriek vibrated through the room, waking me instantly. Adrenaline rushed through my veins as I scrambled to find my glasses and put on my house coat. Bill made it down the stairs first, searching for the source of the cry. "Austin?" Bill called out. I made my way to the family room to find the boys' sleeping bags scattered across the floor. Cartoons were playing in the background. Bill rushed to the kitchen when he realized the patio door was left ajar. Bill sprinted down the deck stairs with me right behind him. That's when we spotted Austin, crying in the back corner of the yard. It was a camouflaged mess of bloody branches, leaves, and mud. Andy climbed out of a narrow pit, holding Steven's body in its hands. Andy placed the limp body on the grass with a soulman look in our direction. "What have you done?" Bill cried, tears streaming down his face. Steven's body was impaled, blood oozing out of his wounds. It smelled of death, feces, and rotting flesh. I peered into the pit, gagging as I looked away. It was maybe 4 feet in depth, but the bottom was lined with jagged rocks and sharp branches. There were carcasses stuck to the bottom, what looked like the remains of cats and dogs. How did we not see this hole from hell? Bill's rage boiled over as he pushed Andy into the pit. I looked on in terror, holding Austin close. As Andy fell in, its monitor short-circuited from the impact. Its limbs, still intact, moved jerkily like a bug trapped on his back. We all sat there in disbelief, mourning poor Steven. The police compensated Andy, as Bill and myself were held for questioning. Sherry's parents were looking after Austin in our absence. They informed us that the news had traveled quickly. Human IT Incorporated issued a statement suspending operations, no doubt bracing themselves for any potential legal blowback, and we were now known as the negligent killer robot owners to the media. The worst of it all was the impact that it had on Austin. He was no longer speaking to anyone, isolating himself in his room. All of the progress made this year was for nothing. After what felt like days, a police officer led me into a room where Bill was sitting. The head detective on the case, Agent Harold, introduced himself alongside a representative from Human IT Incorporated, Carrie Bingham. "This is something you both need to see. Our forensic team has examined the black box contained inside of Andy." Agent Harold pointed to what looked like a hard drive across the table. They were able to recover most of the video. The box stores a rolling 1 month of footage, taken directly from the eyes of Andy, Carrie explained. She added a caveat. "I just want to say before we start, Human IT takes this incident very seriously. We are so sorry for what happened, and we will be looking into improvements immediately. You're delusional if you think anyone could buy another Andy after this, I thought." She hit the play button as we saw the timestamp dated 3 weeks prior to the incident. Austin was in the backyard pointing at a photo in one of his many military history books. Carrie stopped the video and zoomed into the frame. It was a photo of a dugout, a foxhole of sorts, that Andy proceeded to dig. "Make note of the careful planning between the two here," Agent Harold added. Now fast forward to the night before the incident, please, Carrie. The next video was quick, moving 1 minute per second. The frame showed clearly the series of events. The boys and Andy playing around with their toys, watching movies, and falling asleep. A seemingly normal sleepover. The last video started at 8 a.m., the morning of Steven's death. Andy powered up and headed straight to the yard to do the mowing. He got about an hour in before something caught his attention. Andy sprinted towards the camouflaged pit, revealing the deceased Steven and a crying Austin. Andy went into the pit to fetch Steven's lifeless body before I saw myself enter the screen. Carrie stopped the video. I looked over at Bill with a look of despair. I could see him looking defeated as he looked away from the monitor. Carrie chimed in. I think it's important to note here that this model was still found to be sinking. The bond was never established between host and unit. I looked over at Bill, confused with what I was hearing. This was an elaborate trap, Mr. and Mrs. Doherty, Agent Harold said as he closed the laptop. I hope you realize that not everyone deserves to have friendship. Australia is known for featuring some of the most dangerous animals to ever evolve on this planet. But what would you say is the most dangerous of them all? Depending on who you ask, some may say the funnel web spider, the box jellyfish, the taipan snake, the blue-ringed octopus, or the cone snail. If you ask me, I'd say the duck-billed platypus. I know what you're thinking. What's so dangerous about the silly-looking beaver duck? And a few years ago, I'd probably be thinking the same thing as you are. But I know from experience that platypi are no laughing matter. My older brother Derek learned that the hard way a couple years ago. I still miss Derek. I think about him constantly. Had I known what would have happened to him, I never would have let him go out that day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the summer of 2018, Derek took me into the woods in our backyard to go fishing in a nearby river. I was 16 and he was 18 at the time. As soon as we arrived, my brother pointed to the big rock on the riverbank. "Look," he shouted with excitement. Laying on the rock, basking in the sun, was a big brown platypus. The animal had its eyes closed and didn't seem to hear us. We had occasionally seen platypi swimming in the river from a distance, but this was the first time we had ever seen one up close. "That's odd," I said, scratching my head with bewilderment. "Don't they usually rest in burrows? I've never seen a platypus out here in the open like this." I turned to Derek and nearly dropped my fishing rod when I noticed him creeping close to the sleeping animal with one hand extended. "Derek, what are you doing?" I hissed. "I'm just gonna touch it real quick," he replied. "I want to see how its fur feels." "Don't," I said back. "We're not supposed to touch wildlife, remember?" "It's a platypus," he said calmly. "What's it going to do?" As soon as he placed his fingers on the creature's back, he let out a loud yell in pain. The platypus had jumped, startled by Derek's hand, before leaping off the rock and darted back into the water. I got a brief glimpse of a torn-like spike on one of the animal's hind legs, tipped with Derek's blood, before it dove out of sight. I turned to Derek as he groaned in pain, grabbing his bleeding wrist with his other hand as he gritted his teeth. "This is why we're not supposed to touch wildlife," I shouted at him. I know, he cried. "Just get me home quickly and help me bandage up the wound." I dragged Derek home and told our parents what had happened. We then helped him wash the wound, put disinfectant ointment on it, and wrapped it in a bandage. An hour later, I checked back on him and asked him how he was feeling. He told me that even though the bleeding stopped, his hand still hurt like crazy, and he could feel the swelling in the area the platypus stabbed him. As you can probably guess, I was starting to get concerned. I called the hospital and told them about the whole situation. The lady on the other end explained to me that the male platypus had a venomous spur on each hind leg, and that while it isn't deadly to humans, it is extremely painful, and due to how rare platypus stings are, there's been very little research done on their venom, and thus very little I could do to help my brother. No painkillers could alleviate it, unless we injected a deadly amount of morphine, and the only way to stop it completely would be to sever the nerve where the animal stung him. She went on to tell me the best thing to do would be to keep him inside, give him plenty of water, and keep an eye on his wound. I thanked her for the advice and hung up. For the next few days, Derek got worse and worse. Every night, I could hear the most horrific screams, cries, and moans I have ever heard from a human coming from his room. I would do my best to cover my ears as one or both of our parents would go to comfort him. Whenever I went to check on him in the morning, I would notice huge gashes dug into his plaster wall. Derek's fingertips would be bleeding and his nails worn down from scratching into the wall. He also had bite marks from his own teeth on his wrist, and blood all over his face from chewing on his lips and tongue. His swelling was getting worse and was beginning to leak foul-smelling pus. One night, I noticed Derek was quieter than usual. I went to his room to check on him and found it empty. I then heard a loud horse breathing sound coming from the kitchen downstairs and ran down to check. The sight before me nearly made me vomit. Derek was standing by the counter, his expression stoic and his eyes bloodshot. In one hand, he held our father's Bowie knife, which he was using to carve into his swollen wrist. He had already cut down to the bone, and a pool of blood was forming on the counter and dripping onto the floor. "Derek," I said, struggling to speak. What are you doing?" He turned to me, letting out raspy pants every second. "I can't take it anymore," he said, his voice just about a whisper. "It hurts. I have to stop it." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and called 000. An ambulance came to rush him to the emergency room. As the paramedics dragged him into the ambulance, he screamed and demanded them to let him finish amputating himself. The next day, I heard back from the hospital. While they had succeeded in fixing the damage the knife caused to Derek's wrist, he was still in horrible pain from the venom. He was continuing to scream and moan and cry, outright begging the hospital staff to kill him and permanently end his agony. Since painkillers wouldn't do any good when it came to platypus venom, the doctors briefly considered amputating his hand. However, since it had been a few days since he had been stung, the venom had probably spread to the rest of his body by now, so amputation wouldn't do any good. They decided the best thing to do was to keep him under watch and to see if his symptoms got better or worse. The staff sent me and my parents security videos of Derek in the hospital room. Each one was worse than the last one. Some of them showed Derek merely laying in bed, making horrible animalistic cries and moans. Others showed him biting or scratching himself violently. Still, others showed him running to the door and screaming for the staff to kill him. We also heard reports of Derek physically attacking hospital staff and leaving horrible bites and scratches on them. Eventually, my mother told the hospital to stop sending us the videos. We had seen enough. 1 year passed. The hospital would send us an occasional update on Derek's condition, with longer spans of time between each update. We rarely talked about Derek at home, but we thought about him constantly. We all sunk into a terrible depression and rarely ate or slept. Just last year, they told us that since there was no sign of him improving physically or mentally, they would have no choice but to euthanize him. They would allow us one more visit before they did so. Derek was barely recognizable as the same person I had known for all my childhood. He was strapped to the hospital bed to keep him from harming himself and others. His body was pale and emaciated, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in years. His fingertips had dry blood in place of nails. His face, oh God, his face. His lids were shut, having gouged out his own eyes a while back. His lips were torn, exposing his pale pink gums. His teeth had been ground down to their roots, and his tongue had been chewed off. Every single hair on his head had been pulled out, showing his pale, bloody scalp, as his vocal cords had been torn to shreds from screaming so much. He was no longer able to speak, just produce raspy breathing sounds. Even though he couldn't scream anymore, we knew he was still in horrible pain. None of us could look at him much longer. Even after his funeral, the sight of him strapped to the hospital bed still haunts my nightmares, along with those horrible screams and moans he made when he was still able to speak. However, I took one photo of Derek during our last visit. Whenever I want to warn people how dangerous platypi are and they don't believe my story, all I have to do is show them that photo of the emaciated, deformed figure in the hospital bed. That's all it takes to convince them to give platypuses a wide berth. Sure, the venom itself didn't kill Derek, but I wish it had, before he'd gotten as bad as he was. I still sometimes go by the river where that fateful incident occurred, and I sometimes see a platypus or two swimming by. Every time I see one, I immediately turn and dash back home, because all I can think about whenever I see one of those odd little critters is Derek, and the brutal lesson he taught me about messing with wildlife, no matter how harmless or silly it seems. Have you ever heard the story of Jam Jam the ice cream man? No? Well, that's okay. Not many people outside of my town know who Jam Jam is. In life, his name was James Dern, and he was a pretty simple guy. All he wanted in life was to make children happy. Supposedly, from the stories I've heard growing up, James Dern was not the most handsome, nor the brightest, but he was incredibly loving and giving. His parents were extremely controlling and extremely religious, to an obsessive degree. It seems everything that James did was wrong in the eyes of his parents. He laughed too loudly. He smiled too broadly. They didn't like him telling jokes or dancing because children of God should be serious about life. This constant disapproval and subsequent punishment for his wrongdoings eventually started to eat away at James' cheerful disposition. He kept trying to fight it though, and he kept trying to do what he thought was his reason for being, making people happy. In high school, James started dressing up as a clown and going to local children's hospitals after school. He would make balloon animals and tell the patients jokes to cheer them up. His parents and their circle of friends thought what James was doing was making a mockery of the sick, and told him that if he really wanted to help them, he would offer up prayers at the hospital instead of being a clown. When James became an adult, he scrapped together all of his savings and bought a truck. Combining his love for ice cream and his passion with making people, especially children, happy. I always thought the reason he focused on making children happy was because his own childhood was marred with such sadness and cruelty, but I digress. Anyways, because James had such an innocence about him and childlike personality, rumors started after he opened his ice cream truck for business, that a grown man could not possibly be that way unless it was a ruse for some nefarious purposes. But even with the rumors about James circulating, his ice cream truck was a hit. He started dressing up in his old clown outfits and went by the name Jam Jam the Ice Cream Man. All the children and most parents loved him, and whenever they'd hear his truck jingle, they'd come running in droves. One day, Jam Jam was running late on his route, but was insistent that he do it anyway, knowing that it made people happy to see him in his ice cream truck rolling around. The sun had just set and the air was cool as Jam Jam happily drove around in his truck. He slammed on his brakes as he turned the corner onto a Bernathy bridge, the horrific scene in front of him rooting him to the spot. A group of teenage boys stood around a naked, unconscious girl, some zipping up their pants, some peeing on the poor girl. Jam Jam honked his horn to scare the boys off, and when they looked up and saw him, they sneered and ran off, shouting obscenities at him as they left. Jam Jam got out of his truck and ran to the girl, using his clown top to cover her body, uncaring of the coldness settling in on his lanky tank top covered frame. He gently nudged her and brushed her long hair out of her face. He noticed blood on the girl's lips and cried in fear as he inspected her mouth, revealing her tongue had been cut out. He screamed and cried for help, trying to get anyone's attention that may have been near. It was then that the town's biggest gossip came jogging by, dragging her Yorkshire Terrier by its leash. She had been scolding the little dog on not going to the bathroom yet when she saw Jam Jam hovering over the girl clad only in his tank top and clown pants. The woman screamed and ran off as Jam Jam tried desperately to get her to call someone for help. He had no phone, and he didn't want to leave the poor girl by herself. She was still alive, but just barely. After a moment, angry shouts came from down the road, and Jam Jam stood up to flag them down, not knowing that the men were coming for him. The lady had told anyone and everyone she could find that Jam Jam had hurt and possibly killed a young girl down by a Bernathy bridge. She came to the house where some of the boys who attacked the girl lived, and as she told their father what she saw, the boys quickly agreed and lied that they had also seen Jam Jam but ran off because they were scared of him. His momentary relief was quickly shot down as some of the men grabbed him and violently dragged him into the nearby woods. The other men stayed behind to get the girl to the hospital. Jam Jam cried and yelled for them to listen to what happened and what he saw, but the men were crazed with a violent mob mentality. "Freak," they shouted, as they pried open his mouth to cut out his tongue. "Knew there was something not right about you," others screamed as they spat on him. "A grown man acting the way you do? Of course you'd be a pedo," more yelled. The mob was practically rabid in their hate for this guy they always deemed as odd. After cutting off his tongue, the men strung up poor Jam Jam in the woods as he whimpered and cried. Jam Jam's fear and pain and confusion morphed into rage and hate as he hung there wondering why this was to be his end when his entire life was about making others happy. He vowed to himself that he would have his revenge. After Jam Jam took his last breath, the men cheered and set his body on fire. But they were not done with their hate. The one possession that Jam Jam owned and took such pride in was his ice cream truck. The men laughed as they banded together as one to push Jam Jam's beloved truck into the river that ran under a Bernathy bridge. The young girl miraculously survived, and when she learned what happened to Jam Jam, she cried silently for days after she wrote down to authorities what really happened on that fateful night. The police arrested the boys that had actually raped the young girl, but the small mob of men that murdered Jam Jam were never tried. The reason being that they were acting in self-defense for the girl on the assumption that Jam Jam was assaulting her. It honestly didn't matter what they did. The damage had been done. An innocent man was tortured and killed by a group of people that already had prejudice against him for being what they deemed to be different. And ever since then, our town has been in the grips of Jam Jam's revenge. Or so it goes, I guess. I do believe the story about the girl and Jam Jam's innocence, however, because my source for that is someone I highly trust. My great aunt was the poor girl on the bridge, but as far as Jam Jam's revenge, I don't know how much I believe since I've never seen anything. According to rumors, people walking around past dusk will start to hear the jingle of his ice cream truck. If you hear the jingle, you're pretty much marked for death. They said Jam Jam lets you hear the jingle of his ice cream truck to know that he is coming for you, and later, While you're in your nice warm bed thinking you're safe, you'll hear it again, the jingle. Jam Jam will come to your room, and you'll smell the scent of scorched flesh before you actually see him. Slowly, very slowly, you'll start to see the blackened claws of his fingers as he snakes his way on your bed. You won't be able to run as his badly burned and decayed face looms over you. And then, just when you open your mouth to scream, he rips your tongue from you. Honestly, now that I think about it, I don't believe it. Rather, I don't want to believe it. Considering that I was on my way to my girlfriend's house to drop off some textbooks she left at my place. I thought I could get there in time and be back before the sun set, but my neighbor Edward stopped me to chat and I lost track of time. The sun had just set, but it's fine. I'm almost at my house anyway. Hey Brian, you hear that? My next door neighbor called to me from his driveway. His family had just moved here about a month ago from Texas, so he hadn't heard the story of Jam Jam the ice cream man. I shook my head no in response to his question, although I did hear it. Clear as day. I hurried in as my neighbor called out to me. What the hell do you suppose an ice cream man is doing out at this time of night? Just to give some context, I'm currently in the UK and the town where I live is known for its drug scene, but it doesn't have a violent crime problem to speak of. I think that's why I found what happened so shocking, because I lived in London before, and while some messed up stuff did happen to me there, it was nowhere near on the level of what happened to me earlier this year. My partner and I live together in our flat, which is in a relatively busy residential area. I work from home, however, and he's out of the flat quite a lot, so I guess it might look to an outside observer like I live alone. Our flat complex was once an old factory, and we have these huge industrial windows, so people walking on the street have a pretty clear view of our dining room, which is where I work during the day. It all started in July of this year. I'm ashamed to say that I can be a major rubbernecker, and a lot of drama occurs on the road outside of our flat, so I look out the windows often during my workday for some light entertainment. The best was a 2-hour breakup I got to watch unfold in the car just below our window, but that's beside the point. One day, I got up to make myself a cup of tea, looked out the kitchen window, and saw this guy just staring at me. I was struck by how intense it was and how he didn't look away, even when it was obvious that I was looking back at him. I felt creeped out by it, but I tried not to let it bother me. We have a lot of drug addicts and other weird characters that hang around here, so it didn't seem like such a big deal. I went back to work, and by the time I sat down at the table, he was gone. About a week later, my partner had gone to visit his dad for the weekend, so I was excited to hunker down and catch up on some of my favorite shows. After about 30 minutes, the buzzer to the flat rang. The buzzer is so loud, and it scared the heck out of me. I was lucky my popcorn didn't go flying out of my hands. Now, our flat complex has this big porch where teenagers and addicts love to hang out, because it provides shelter from the rain and about 4 people can sit down inside of it. Sometimes people lean up on the buzzers by accident when they're hanging out in the porch, so I assumed that was what happened. After a few seconds, however, the buzzer went again, and again, and again. Someone was pressing it in this rhythmic pattern. It's something I know my partner does when he's forgetting his keys, and it's kind of our code for me to let him in, which is why I found it so disconcerting. At first, I was worried he might have missed the bus to his dad's house and had decided to come back to the flat. I was nearly about to buzz him straight in when I thought it was a good idea to pick up the phone first and check who it was. As soon as I picked up the phone, the person standing next to the intercom must have heard, because they said, "Hello?" It was definitely not my partner. I asked who it was and why they were buzzing the flat so late at night, but all they said was, "Can you let me in?" I asked them why they wanted to come in, and they said, "You invited me, remember?" While they were talking, they kept kind of laughing under their breath, and the whole exchange put me on edge. I told them I had no idea who they were and just hung up. I was half expecting them to start pressing the buzzer again, but they didn't. After a few minutes, I crept out of the flat to have a look at who was in the porch, but they were long gone. My partner has to get up early for work, whereas I'm more of a night owl. Most nights, I'm up until around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., working on my laptop while he sleeps. A few nights ago after the intercom incident, I was on my laptop watching videos and I realized that we'd forgotten to take the trash out. This happens a lot, and it's not uncommon for me to take the trash out around 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. At least, it wasn't until all this happened. I put my slippers on, grabbed the bag of trash, and took it outside to the curb outside the flat's main entrance. When I looked across the street, there was the guy standing on the opposite street corner. He was watching me, and his eyes followed me all the way from the front door to the curb. I noticed he was smoking, so I assumed he lived in one of the houses across the street. I remember even thinking, wouldn't it be creepy if he tried to come over here? As I put the trash bag down, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and saw him walking in a straight line across the road towards me, with his eyes fixed on me the entire time. I don't know how to describe it, but the look on his face filled me with this instinctive sense of dread. It felt like someone had just turned my stomach inside out. I pulled my keys out of my hoodie pocket, turned around, and ran to the front door. I've never felt that kind of fear before, and it was like my body was compelling me to get as far away from this man as possible. I got into the building, slammed the door behind me, and rushed to my flat without looking back. I didn't want to know whether he'd followed me or not. I told my partner about the whole thing the next day and how shook I was. We agreed that we'd be more proactive with the trash, and I've never taken it out late at night again. Fast forward to the beginning of August, about 2 weeks after the trash incident, and I pretty much forgotten about all of it. I was still too scared to go out late at night on the road, but nothing weird had happened since then. I went to bed at about 2 a.m., but I felt restless for some reason and struggled to get to sleep. By about 3 a.m., I was contemplating whether or not to give up and go do something else when I heard this scream. The sound cut right through me. There was something visceral about the terror in that scream. I knew it was bad, because my partner went from stone cold asleep to being up in a shot. He asked me what it was, and I said I didn't know. I went to the window straight away and looked out. Down one of the side roads near our flat, I could see headlights, but couldn't get a clear view of the car. The screaming continued in bursts, and after a while, I could make out words. It was a woman, and she was saying, get out, over and over again. I'm used to hearing all kinds of domestic arguments take place on the road outside of our flat, particularly since we're near the university and several popular bars, but this was different. There was this raw fear in her voice that made the hairs on my arm stand up. I turned to my partner and said I had to call the police. When they picked up and I explained what was happening, they seemed disinterested at first, but the operator's tone changed when I told them where it was. I think they must have been getting calls from all around the area about it. It was sometime during this call that I heard a screech of tires and the screaming stop. The operator asked me to go to the window and describe to them what was happening. When I looked down, there was this black car parked in the road. One of the neighbors from across the road was speaking to the two guys in the car. I had to twist to get a good look at them, but one of the guys in the car looked uncannily like the guy who had been watching me when I was putting out the trash that time. At first, the conversation seemed congenial, but it took a turn when the neighbors asked them some sort of question that I couldn't hear, and they sped off down the road. Within no less than 10 minutes, 3 police cars arrived and had blocked off the roads leading to our flat. They were knocking on doors and asking to speak to all of our neighbors. I told my partner that we should go out and speak to them, since we saw a lot of what happened, and my partner had the foresight to write down the license plate of the black car. When we went out, there was these 2 girls talking to one of the police officers. They were both shaking, and one of them looked as though she had been crying. I decided to stand nearby and wait for the girls to finish before speaking with the officer myself. What they said made my blood run cold. They were from one of the houses that looked out directly onto the road where I had seen the headlights, so they had a clear view of what had happened. Like us, they had been alerted by the screaming and gone straight to the window. From what they could gather, the black car had cut off the small red car on the road, and that's what had caused the girl driving the red car to scream the first time. They thought it might have been some kind of misunderstanding, but then they watched as one of the guys from the black car got out, walked to the red car, and jumped through the window. That's the point when the girl must have been screaming, "Get out, get out." There had been a struggle, and the girls watching said they assumed the guy was trying to steal the car, but then he forced the driver into the back seat, and that's when he drove off. The 2 girls were both hysterical by this point, and you could tell they felt guilty for not intervening. I could feel that same guilt seeping into my thoughts as well. After the guy had driven off in the red car, the 2 men in the black car had gone the opposite way and turned the corner onto our road, but had been stopped by another neighbor. Although this neighbor had been alerted by the screaming, he hadn't actually witnessed what happened. So he had stopped the black car to ask the guys what was going on without knowing they were involved. That was the exchange we saw. When the guys started acting suspicious, he asked them if they would wait for the police to arrive, and that's when they drove off. It wasn't until we got back to the flat that I started to put 2 and 2 together. I have a small red car, just like the one the girls had described, and I normally come back at night on that day of the week, since it's the day I go to visit my parents. I had only come back early on this particular occasion because I needed to let the plumber in to do some work on the flat. What if they had been waiting for me and they had gotten the wrong car? Over the next few days, I contacted the police several times and checked the local news, but I never heard anything about the girl who was kidnapped. I still have no idea what happened to her. All I know is that they found her car abandoned somewhere not far from where she was taken, but she wasn't in the car. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. We fell in love over music. Cassie always said you could figure out someone's personality solely by listening to their playlist. In a way, I guess she was right. That's how it worked for the 2 of us. Our best dates were at concerts and festivals. While our tastes weren't always entirely the same, we could discuss our favorite albums, artists, and even music videos for hours. Maybe her love for music is what inspired the earworm. Cassie worked at a technology company, the kind that focuses mainly on finding the newest, biggest, most innovative idea out there. She was rather a big shot in there, which consequently meant that she had to travel a crazy amount of time. I remember when she told me about earworm for the first time. Her eyes were shining so bright. Earworm is a little device that you can plant inside your ear. You get them in a set of 2, one for yourself and one for your significant other. When you get a song stuck in your head, they will hear it too. Having a song stuck in your head can be pretty annoying in my opinion, so I wasn't entirely sure why she was so excited about the thing. Well, obviously music is the first step, but don't you think it's absolutely insane that we are able to do this in the first place? She said as her eyes grew even bigger. Can you read thoughts with it as well? I asked. Why? Are you afraid I'll hear all your dirty little secrets? Cassie laughed. No, of course not. Although if the technology becomes more advanced, maybe we can in the future. She raised an eyebrow. I didn't particularly like the work she did, or how her ethical boundaries seemed to become more blurry each day. Cassie was in no way evil, but I believe sometimes she got so excited over all the possibilities of innovation that she started ignoring the downsides. Not everyone would like what they were coming up with. Although if you think about it, many were and still are wary of smartphones when they came out. We've all accepted being tracked. Soon enough, we will probably be alright with something reading our mind. Though for now, it was only music. Music that my love and I would share. The annoying earworms as well as the songs that came to our mind when we thought of each other. A way for us to share our biggest interest while we were apart, as Cassie had to go abroad for 2 months to introduce Earworm to their partner company. I will be working crazy hours and I won't have much time for anything else. I just wanted us to stay connected as well as we can, and you'd be helping me test Earworm as well. She grinned. Alright, but no musicals. We got the devices planted inside of our ears on the day of her departure. It didn't hurt or anything, but it did feel a little strange, like it wasn't supposed to be there. At first, there was nothing, possibly because my mind was pretty blank as I drove my girlfriend to the airport later that day. I guess hers was as well. We stayed quiet for quite some time, but just before we reached the airport, I learned what technology advancement really meant. Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. Can you repeat the question? Cassie suddenly started singing. I hadn't even realized that I was thinking of a song. I was watching Malcolm in the Middle that morning. I guess the intro just came to my mind. That is insane, I laughed. And pretty cool too, right? She asked. I guess. It's definitely different. We'll take them out when I get back, if you want to, she said. Depends if you're gonna torture me with your terrible taste over there. I joked as we got her suitcase out of the car. I hugged her, we kissed goodbye, and that was it. For hours, there was silence, until she texted me that she had landed. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. She was listening to music now. I heard it very faintly, like background music in a movie. I lay in bed just listening to what Cassie heard in her ears all those miles away. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. The following days we hardly called or texted. Our communication went mainly through music, and it was the most exciting interaction we'd ever had. Sometimes I'd be doing something absolutely mundane, like getting groceries, when I suddenly heard a song I loved as a kid, but had completely forgotten. I had to keep myself from smiling like a moron in public because Cassie would listen to some trash hits to get my attention and annoy me. We made a game out of it. Who could find the most obscure hits that we would both have stuck in our minds? It was even more interesting when we were both listening to music at the same time. Only one of the songs would get stuck in both of our minds, or sometimes I'd get hers and she'd get mine. It was pretty exciting until it wasn't anymore. As with any other type of technology, you get used to it quite quickly, and then you either get addicted to it, or you'll be bored out of your mind. As for me, it was just getting really fucking annoying. Cassie had music in her ears most hours of the day, and if she didn't, there'd be a tune stuck in her mind. Usually one verse of some annoying song that I would hear over and over again. As we were in different time zones, sometimes I'd hear music until the latest hours. My sleeping schedule was absolutely wrecked. All I was longing for was a little bit of silence. Just a moment alone with my thoughts and without another sound. I couldn't believe I'd ever reached that point in life, but I was sick of music. Cassie begged me to keep the earworm inside just a little longer. She and her team had a big meeting ahead of them, and they needed the data they were collecting through us. Can you just try to listen to a little less music? Or maybe shut your mind off a bit? I asked her over the phone. Cassie stayed silent for a moment. Yeah, I can try. I always wanted to meditate, she joked. And I won't listen to music when it's nighttime for you, she promised. And for days, she kept that promise. We still heard each other's earworms at times, but it went back to being nice. On my birthday, she woke me up with my favorite song. She had to get up at 3 a.m. for that. To die by your side is such a heavenly way to die. To die by your side. Well, the pleasure, the privilege is mine. Despite everything, it felt nice to be connected, especially through the one thing we love so much. There were only a few days left until Cassie would come back, but last night, the music was louder than ever before. I was asleep already when she started playing the song. I knew she had to be listening to it because it was far louder than a song stuck in her head. I learned to make the distinction. This one was blasting through her stereo. I've been waiting for a guide to come and take me by the hand. Cassie didn't like Joy Division. Maybe she had people over. I tried to shut off the song in my mind and get back to bed, but it would keep playing on repeat, and it'd get louder each time. Lights are flashing, cars are crashing, getting frequent now. Finally, I had enough and text her, Cass, can you turn it down, please? I have to work tomorrow. It felt strange that I had to tell her to turn down a song in my mind. No idea if that was something I could get used to. She didn't respond to my text. Instead, the song started playing again. I'm watching you, I'm watching. Oh, I'll take no pity from your friends. My ears were almost bleeding. I was entirely fed up with her. I started thinking that she was pissed at me. Maybe I'd forgotten something important, or hell knows what, and she wanted to punish me. I felt a migraine settling in. It really drove me nuts. I was so close to just ripping that implant out of my ear, but then all of a sudden, I heard something else. Joy Division was still playing, but it was mixed with a different tune now. So when you're near me, darling, can't you hear me? SOS. And the love you gave me, nothing else can save me. SOS. Abba, seriously? I text her again. Cass, are you watching Mamma Mia again? You promised no musicals. Again, there was no response. It felt strange that she was listening to 2 songs at the same time, with the ABBA one being so faint in comparison. I was quite tired then. I'd only woken up after all. But when I made the connection, I shot right out of bed. Was she trying to send me a message? I kept calling her again and again, but she wouldn't pick up. Until all of a sudden, the music was gone. Though there was certainly no silence instead. The music was replaced with the most dreadful sound I ever heard in my life. It sounded like pure agony. Voices that I didn't know were screaming and crying. It's hard to describe the noises because they were like nothing I'd ever heard before. Something about them just felt wrong, in a way that made the hairs on my skin stand up and my toenails curl. They were hurting the insides of my soul. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped the device out of my ear, which at this point was already bleeding. After Cassie still didn't respond to anything I sent her, I called one of her colleagues, a guy that worked in the earworm team as well. He promised me that he had been testing the device for weeks now, with nothing remotely close ever happening to him. But this wasn't only about the device anymore. I could tell that something was awfully wrong. It took a while, but I convinced him that there might be something happening to Cassie. I was sure that wearing the device was somehow hurting her. Maybe the worm was digging deep into her brain and she couldn't take it anymore. He called the rest of the team, but nobody knew what was going on. At that point, it was the middle of the night over there and people were getting worried. When they finally called the police to go and check on her in the Airbnb, it was already far too late. It wasn't the worm that hurt her. Cassie had been brutally murdered by some monster that the police still haven't found. When the police broke into the apartment, the Joy Division song was still playing on repeat, the song that was supposed to overshadow her screams. I haven't listened to any music since I lost my sweet Cassie. I don't think I'll ever enjoy music again. All I hear now is the sound. The last sound I heard before crushing that implant. It will follow me until the day I die, and maybe even beyond. I believe I heard what death sounds like. I didn't know Amy. I had never met her. Neither had any of my friends. Still, when I saw the poster of a missing girl in the town I used to call home, a suffocating feeling befell me. The feeling you have when something is entirely and utterly wrong. You can tell inside your soul that it is not how life is supposed to be. A girl so young, simply disappearing, leaving a family in pain. It's not something that should ever happen. And when it does, it can do strange things to the ones that witness it. Parents were particularly careful with their children now. Only to school and back, and none of you will walk alone. Jonah, watch your brother. I heard a mother call out to both of her sons as I walked to the grocery store to get some eggs for breakfast. Those words remind me of something. What do you call a nostalgia that is only bitter and not sweet? I faintly remember that we had a similar situation during my childhood. I was 5 or maybe 6 when a kid in town went missing. I'm not even sure whether I knew that child. I assume not very well. All I know is that the time was hard on all of us. Gately had a dark shadow cast over it. We lived in fear and dread. It was around then that many families left our town for good. Their homes felt stained. The memories of that time are blurry, but the emotions make up for it. When I think of that time in my life, a shiver goes down my spine. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake it off. I guess it even felt more wrong due to the contrast. Gately is absolutely lovely and vivid when the terrible isn't around the corner. Most people are friendly and kind. The ones that never left were prone to assure that all the ones who stayed felt safe. I believe it worked. I for once had a pretty great childhood here. There was more than enough to explore. Clubs to join, and even events were held regularly. Even when I went to college, I always looked forward to the times I would visit Gately. Just like now, I was looking forward to Dad's cooking and Grandma's baking. I was looking forward to seeing Maddie and Nicholas again, my childhood friends. I was definitely looking forward to the carnival that would be coming to town after I saw all the posters advertising the events. There was a big one next to the entrance of the grocery store, although it hardly stood up, surrounded by the many faces of the same girl. Posters of a missing girl, just like all those years ago. The picture was in black and white, but her shoulder-length hair must have been of the lightest blonde. Her eyes resembled 2 black buttons staring towards the camera. She was neither smiling nor frowning. Her expression looked almost apathetic in a way. Poor girl, she was so sweet. Gosh, and so young too. My head turned towards the voice that was speaking. I wasn't used to people randomly chatting me up anymore. I guess that is a small town thing. When did she go missing? I asked the elderly woman next to me. She didn't respond to my question. Poor little Amy. I hope they find her soon. She mumbled before walking inside the grocery store. The longer I looked at the poster, the worse I started to feel. It felt like it was hurting something I didn't even know existed inside of me. Finally, I managed to look away and went inside to get the eggs. As Dad, Grandma, and I sat around the kitchen table, having a late arrival breakfast for me, I was greeted by the face again, this time on a milk carton. "Have you seen Amy?" "I didn't realize they actually printed these on milk cartons," I mumbled. "What do you mean?" my father asked. "The missing kid. I thought these only existed in movies," I said as I held up the carton. "Oh, that poor little Amy. What a horrible, horrible occurrence," my grandma chimed in. "Absolutely, such a tragedy," my father added. "Did you know her?" I asked. "I don't believe I've ever seen her in town. Although most kids kinda look the same anyway, I guess." Both Grandma and Dad were now looking at me. Their eyes were filled with disgust. "Such a young soul. I hope she will be found soon," Grandma mumbled, ignoring my question. "Who are her parents?" I asked. "Yes, kids should be with their parents," Grandma said as she grabbed the milk carton. She started inspecting the picture with a look I couldn't quite place. She was smiling, but her eyes looked scared. "No, I mean, who is Amy?" Grandma clawed her nails inside the milk carton, with a strength I didn't know she had. She pushed so deep into the carton that it broke. Milk was splashing everywhere, even to her face, but she didn't react in any way. She simply put the carton back down and continued having breakfast. "I sure hope they find the poor girl soon," she whispered. "What the hell? Why?" I shrieked. Dad cut me off before I could say anything else. His expression was stern. I knew that look. Grandma's mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be, and we weren't supposed to confuse her. "Anyway, you should go visit your friends after breakfast." Dad changed the subject. He smiled, but the milk on his face and on our table were only adding to the absurdity of the situation. While my friends weren't acting as entirely odd as my family, the subject of the missing girl seemed to result in weird reactions in them as well. I was hoping to find some answers with the friends I grew up with, but I only got more questions. Neither Maddie nor Nick knew the girl. They weren't sure who her parents were either. "It's weird, right? I swear, it feels the same," I said. "The same as what?" Maddie asked. "Like 20 years ago, when the other child went missing. Was it a girl too?" Maddie and Nick seemed confused. "There was another missing child?" Nick asked. "Yeah, don't you remember? We weren't allowed to play for weeks and a bunch of people moved away." The two of them exchanged eye contact. "That's strange. Are you sure you didn't make it up?" Nick asked. "And did they ever find the child?" "Not sure," I mumbled. Suddenly, I felt even stranger than before. Maddie smiled. "Of course you're not sure, because it never happened. You shouldn't be spreading rumors. We should be focusing on finding poor little Amy, and that is all," Nick said. I couldn't help but laugh. "What the fuck, guys?" They didn't say anything, but Maddie started gently stroking my arm. "It's okay, buddy. Horrible events as these can really screw with your mind. It will all be fine though. We only need to find Amy." I left Nick's home shortly after. In the past years, I didn't stay in touch with my friends as much as I wanted to over the years, but I still thought I knew them. Today, they felt like absolute strangers. They were odd, just like my father and my grandma. Truly, just like everyone in Gately. It's not that I had intended on speaking about the disappearance that much, but somehow I couldn't let go of it. I felt deeply involved even though I had no idea who Amy was. I didn't have any siblings who were the same age as her, or even cousins, but it still stuck with me. I presume all those pictures of her were part of the reason. Her face was everywhere. I thought there were many posters when I went outside earlier, but now it seems as if the entire town was plastered with them now. People kept saying how terrible it was. They kept repeating that we had to find the girl. Our town seemed supportive, for sure, but nobody seemed to actually do anything. There were posters and pictures everywhere, but I didn't see anyone actually searching. What had the disappearance of Amy done to them? And who were those girls' parents? And why did nobody but I seem to remember the last kidnapping 2 decades ago? No matter who I ask, I simply wouldn't receive an answer, to the point that I even started thinking of the unspeakable. I started wondering whether the people of Gately were somehow involved in the disappearance. Maybe it was somehow connected to the fact that this town is so prosperous and nice all the time. Although, if they were doing child offerings, I suppose they wouldn't be actively hanging posters with her face everywhere. Whatever was going on, it wasn't right. The people that I felt so safe and close with suddenly seemed exchanged. They weren't warm and kind anymore, but empty and frightening. One wrong word and they turned manic. The following days I tried to avoid the subject of the missing girl altogether. I didn't even leave home much and stayed neutral with Dad and Grandma. I didn't see my friends much either, until the first day of the carnival. Nick, Maddie, and I planned to go after Nick finished work. I wasn't as excited about it anymore after the last days, but it felt wrong to shut myself inside the whole time I was visiting. This was my home after all. I'm not sure what I was expecting. The carnival didn't come to town often, and so usually it would have been an exciting day. But as soon as I got close to the area, all of that was gone. This carnival was nothing more than a shell. The rides, the booths, the games, while all lights and music were turned on, none of them were really being operated. There were posters of the missing girl everywhere. People seemed to be walking around mindlessly. Townspeople that I recognized, like the librarian or school teachers, were there, though none of them seemed like themselves. They all had a forced smile on their face, while their eyebrows were turned into a frown. They were muttering words to themselves, the same ones they'd been repeating for days. Some of them had blood stains on them, but none of them seemed to care. When I looked over to my friends, I noticed the same stare. "Did you hear about that little girl going missing? Bless her poor little soul," Maddie whispered in a voice that didn't sound like hers. "Isn't it terrible that one among us is capable of such horrors?" Nick asked. I didn't say a word. I simply turned around to get home as quickly as I could. Whatever was going on at that carnival, I didn't want to witness it. Everyone had lost their minds. I ran all the way home. I had absolutely no idea what was happening to the town. The people didn't seem like themselves, and while I knew how absurd they were acting, the suffocating feeling inside of me wouldn't go away. I could only hope that somebody would find this girl soon. I took a deep breath before going inside my childhood home. I was dreading seeing my dad and grandma the way I saw my friends. I had no idea how to deal with that. Grandma was alone. I wasn't sure whether that was a good or bad thing. As I walked inside, I heard her rummaging through something in the living room. "What's that?" I carefully asked. Grandma didn't answer. She just kept sitting there, looking at pieces of paper. When I saw what she was looking at, I thought about turning around again. They were posters of Amy. But then I got closer, mostly because I was worried about Grandma, and I realized that those posters weren't entirely the same. They had different dates on them. Last seen, November 11th, 1995. Last seen, November 11th, 1975. Last seen, November 11th, 1955. Nobody that stayed here remembered the last times. Grandma had it right in front of her, but didn't seem to understand it. I couldn't blame her. I couldn't quite understand it either, why it was affecting us like this. I just can't shake that image out of my head. The picture of Amy with those black button eyes and ash blonde hair. That poor little girl must be afraid and cold, waiting for someone to rescue her. I guess that's why I'm writing to you. We simply must find Amy. Have you seen her? My friend Marco said he made it up, that he got the idea from a horror movie where they played hide and clap, and when we were all racking our brains for a party game on New Year's Eve, Marco had been the first to make a suggestion. That sly smile of his that girls like so much, crinkling his eyes as he told us the rules. The game requires at least 3 people, though 4 or more is better. One person is picked to be the questionnaire, basically the game's version of it or the monster. Everyone else is a whisperer. All of the lights are turned off in the house, and every whisperer goes and hides while the questionnaire sits in the dark and counts to 60. After that, the questionnaire gets up and begins hunting. They're blind, just like the rest, but they have the advantage of asking questions. Feeling their way through the dark, they can call out questions the whisperers must answer, though they may answer softly, as their name implies. It was at this point that Ryan raised his hand with a smirk. What was stopping someone from just not answering or mouthing the words? Marco hadn't returned his smile, instead looking over all 5 of us with a seriousness I wasn't used to from him. That person would have broken the rules of the game and would be punished accordingly. This prompted some laughter from us, but I could already hear some nervous excitement I was feeling echoed in my friends' voices as well. Marco seemed not to notice as he went on. The questions and whispered responses served 2 purposes. The first was the means of locating the whisperers. When someone was found, they became a questionnaire too. If, however, a questionnaire figured out who their prey was before touching them, they could call out the whisperer's name and then grab them, turning them into a sacrifice and putting them out of the game. This continued until everyone had been turned or sacrificed to the dark. When Marco was done, Brittany immediately began turning off lights while Sarah and Jesse started snickering as they headed off to get another drink before we started playing. Marco glanced at me before turning to look at Ryan. Want to be a questionnaire? Ryan frowned. Not really, man. This all sounds lame as shit. No offense. Marco let out a short laugh. I don't know, man. No offense, but it sounds to me like you're just a pussy, scared of the dark. Ryan's face was already darkening when I stood up to walk between them. No, I'll do the question thing. Marco met my eyes. Become the questionnaire? Yeah, that. I'll do it. Darkness is so subjective. When all the lights were off and I was the first blind and alone, I felt uncomfortable, vulnerable. But then I heard a nervous titter of laughter from another room, and I remembered that they were hiding from me. Grinning to myself, I stepped forward carefully and asked my first question. Do you have short hair? I heard a faint yes from somewhere in the dark, followed by a softer no from farther away, maybe up the stairs in the hall I thought I was entering. I froze for a second, but heard nothing else. I went on to something more specific. Did your prom date puke on you? I heard a short yelp of laughter from upstairs, followed by 3 faint no whispers, 2 from upstairs and 1 from the back of the house, but I was waiting for someone else. Yes. I stepped forward and turned to my left, barely remembering to shout out, Brittany, before lunging forward and poking her in the stomach. Grunting bitch, she swatted me away. Yay, I'm sacrificed or whatever. I'm going outside to smoke. She let out a curse as she bumped into a chair and then made her way to and out the front door. I let the echo of the closed door trail off before I asked my next question. Are you going to pre-med? Upstairs faintly. No. Yes. And then downstairs in the back, a single no. I was beginning to wonder about that. There were 6 of us, and yet the most I'd ever heard was 4 whispers. Sarah was pre-med, so she was upstairs. Was one of the others too far away or too quiet for me to hear, or were they just not saying anything? Frowning, I edged along the wall until my foot hit the bottom stair. I wasn't as familiar with Jesse's house upstairs, but at least I knew Sarah was up there somewhere, and oddly enough, I was feeling a strong urge to win, whatever that meant. My hand found the banister as I started making my way up the stairs. I could wait till I got at the top, but maybe if I asked my question on the way up, I could pinpoint Sarah and keep her from trying to slip by. I wasn't sure what to ask next, so I finally just said the next thing that came to me. What do you want to do after this? Drink. Watch a movie. Both upstairs, and I recognized Sarah's voice coming from the right. Watch them all die screaming. I let out a yell as I pitched forward on the stairs, barely catching myself as I rolled over onto my back. That had come from right behind me, nestled in a breath that was hot and rotten as it coiled around my neck. Who was that? Suddenly a light came on upstairs. There was no one on the stairs with me, no one around that I could see at all. Looking behind me, I saw Jesse and Sarah coming down the stairs, worried looks on their faces. Sarah crouched down on the step above me. Are you okay? Did you fall? I shook my head. No, I mean, yeah, but that wasn't why I yelled. I gave a slight shudder as I looked back down the stairs into the dark of the front hall. Someone was right behind me, whispering in my ear. It freaked me out. It must be that fucker Marco. Ryan had suddenly appeared at the top of the stairs too, his face already growing red. That shithead has been weird all night. I don't know if he got into some bad weed on his little camping trip or what, but I'm about ready to pound his fucking... He trailed off as he saw me shaking my head. What? You saying it's not him? I shrugged weakly as I stood up. I don't know. It didn't sound like him. Didn't feel like him at all. Like any of us. Ryan rolled his eyes. Jesus, Tab. I know you've got a crush on him or whatever. Ow. He flinched as Jesse jabbed him in the ribs. He went on with a lowered voice. But you could have gotten hurt, okay? Let's just find him and find out what the hell he was thinking. Nodding, I took Sarah's hand and went back down, hitting the lights at the bottom of the stairs. We started calling out for Marco, and after a minute, Brittany came back in with a questioning look. When we told her what had happened, her momentary look of satisfaction that had fallen was replaced with concern when she saw how upset I was and how angry Ryan was becoming the longer we looked for Marco. 15 minutes later, and we had searched the house and yard for him twice with no luck. Calls to his phone went straight to a full mailbox, and texts got no response either. We were sitting back down in the living room when Jessie gave a small laugh. Happy New Year, I guess. It's 12:03. We all laughed with her, but the sound was brittle. Everyone was unhappy and on edge, and I started to feel guilty about spoiling the party for everyone. Look, I'm sure it's fine. He probably just left as a practical joke, and it worked because it freaked me out. I shrugged. Him not answering his phone is a bit weird, but who knows? Maybe it's part of the prank. I looked at Jessie. Did you call him about the party, or did he call you? She frowned. Neither. I was out jogging yesterday, and when I came back, he was sitting on the steps outside. We hung out for a minute. I asked him about his camping trip after Christmas, and told him about the party tonight. Ryan leaned in. Did he seem okay to you then? Jesse shrugged. I mean, I guess. We only talked a couple of minutes and I was tired. I wasn't looking for anything, you know? He nodded. Yeah, who knows? Him and his weird bullshit game. Smirking, he went on. That's why I didn't even play it. Ryan blushed slightly. Sorry, Tab. Wasn't trying to be a dick to you, but I wasn't playing by his stupid rules either. Just sat upstairs in the bathroom the whole time, quiet as a church mouse. The next day I got a call that Brittany had died from smoke inhalation. Apparently the apartment below hers had an electrical fire that pushed smoke into her bedroom while she slept. They claimed she had never woke up, though I wonder how they knew. Wonder if she had a few moments of clarity before she choked to death on gray air. I didn't have to worry about Ryan. He was working last weekend shift at his father's steel mill before heading back to class. He'd done it every summer and holiday since he was 17. But that night, the night after the party, there was a misroll on one of the hot rolling mills. 30 feet of red, molten steel shot out like spray of burning silly string, hitting the wall and two of the men. It only burned the other man's leg. But Ryan, when he was drunk enough at the wake, Ryan's dad had told me and Sarah that it had coiled around his boy like a python, burning and crushing him down as it tightened, cooling from the air on the outside and the blood and meat within. He'd been on the floor less than 50 feet away, and the last memory he had of his only child was watching helpless as he died screaming. No one has seen or heard from Marco in the last 2 weeks. He still doesn't answer his phone or his door, and no one we ask knows where he is. Last night, I finally tracked down a number for his mother. She lives in Chicago, and we've never spoken, but I figured it was worth a try to see if she heard from him. Hello? Hey, Miss Sandoval? This is Tabitha Morris. I'm a friend of your son Marco. Oh, have you heard from him? I gripped the phone tighter. No, that's what I was going to ask you. We've been looking for him. When did you last hear from him? There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, the woman's voice seemed thinner and more lifeless than before. It was the day after Christmas. He left to go camping, always rushing off to do something, but he was supposed to be back in 2 days. When he didn't come back in 3, I called the park service. They had a record of him camping there, even found where he stayed, but no Marco. Not there or anywhere. No one's seen him since. Another pause, and when she spoke again, a new worm of hope was buried in her words. When did you see him last? Have you seen him since he went camping? I slumped down to the floor, barely hearing the last words to her over the hammering of my heart. No, I don't think I have. Some people ask me why I never use the Street View function on Google Maps. They say things like, how will you know what the place looks like? Or, don't you want to see more than just bird's eye view of the place? I usually reply by saying it's always better to go outside and see things with your own eyes, which usually ends in them commending me for my confidence. Truth be told, the reason I say that is not because of confidence. On the contrary, it's because of fear. To understand where I am coming from, I need to tell you the story of how I first found out about Google Maps. I was in elementary school at the time, and during computer class, instead of doing the assigned project, my friends and I were fooling around on coolmathgames.com. We were playing Fireboy and Water Girl when one of my friends started to speak. Hey, you guys heard of Google Maps? Yeah, my parents use it all the time. But did you know that you can actually see the place on the map, like you are actually there? To my 12-year-old brain, that sounded amazing. I let my friend pull up Google Maps on my computer, then he asked me for a place I wanted to see. How about our school? School? Really? Yeah, I wanted to see how it looks. After typing in the address of our school, my friend dragged this little yellow stick man onto the school address and opened up Street View. I was mesmerized by the picture on the screen. It felt so surreal to be able to navigate and look around as if you were really there. I could see everything, from the broken swings at the playground to the concrete stairs that led to the front door. Something about being able to see things without actually being there appealed to my young mind. Oh, did you know you can see your house too? Here, let me show you my house. My friend typed his address and pulled up Street View on his house. I visited his place many times before, and the house looked just as in real life. The yellow exterior, the white fences at the front, and the garden at the side. Google Maps gave a perfect recreation of my friend's abode. While we were sitting there snickering at my friend's house, the bell rang and it was time to go home. After school, I did my usual routine of going home, searching the pantry for anything to eat, then going up to my room and playing on the computer. I didn't have any homework that night, and my parents said that they were going to be home late, so I had the house all to myself. As a kid, I decided the best thing to do was play flash games as late into the evening as I could. Eventually, I got bored of playing flash games and wondered what I should do. It was just past 6 p.m., but it was dark outside already. I looked out my bedroom window and saw all the houses in my neighborhood with lights shining through their windows. Suddenly, I remembered about the Google Maps thing my friend showed me at school that day. I eagerly opened up Google Maps and typed in my address. Then, I opened up Street View. The image of my home covered my screen. I had a fun time dragging the camera around and seeing everything. I even zoomed into the living room window, imagining that maybe I would see someone if I zoomed in enough. Of course, the window was too blurry after I zoomed in too much. I decided to zoom out again and take a look at my house as a whole. It was then I noticed something odd. There was a man wearing a hoodie near my side gate. I tried zooming onto the man's face, but I could only see the back of his head. For context, the side of my childhood house has a gate that leads into the backyard. Right above that gate was my bedroom window. Being a kid with an imagination, and given it was dark outside, I rushed to my window and pulled back the curtains, expecting to see someone scary when I looked down. I sighed in relief. Of course, there was no one by the side gate. When I got back on my computer, I was greeted by a horrifying sight. The image of a man's crooked face with eyes bulging and a cartoonishly wide smile. I never zoomed out from the man's face before checking the window, so his face filled my whole screen. I instantly zoomed out. I wanted to close my browser, but I was afraid that if I did, the man would go away. Since I zoomed out, I got to see the man's full body. The best way to describe the man was tall, lanky, and crooked. He had a hoodie on, and his hands were in his hoodie pockets. His head was tilted to one side, and his eyes were staring directly at the screen. What really scared me was how his entire torso was facing the screen, as if he knew I was looking at him. The Street View images were all taken during the day, so I reasoned to myself that even if there was a smiling man outside, that could not possibly be happening at this moment. After all, it was already dark out. I looked at the date the image was taken and saw that it was taken months ago. I then looked again outside my window just to confirm no one was at the side gate. Thus, I was reassured there is no way the man was currently outside my house. When I looked back at the computer, my eyes widened. The man stood just as he did moments ago, except one of his hands were outside of his pocket. This hand was giving me a thumbs down. All this time, the man was staring directly at the screen with his bulging eyes and absurd wide smile. I darted downstairs and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I closed all the curtains for all the windows, then locked myself in my room. When I looked back at my computer, I saw the man's face was no longer smiling. Now, it was laughing. I considered closing the browser, but I was deathly afraid of what would happen if I did so. Clearly, it seemed that the man was responding to what I was doing, so I was left staring at his image on my screen. After a few minutes of staring at the man and making sure I don't take my eyes off him, my computer got the blue screen of death. Panicking, I quickly unplugged my computer and plugged it back in, trying to restart it. The screen came alive and showed the Windows XP boot up screen. There was nothing but silence throughout the entire house. I sat there looking at the boot up screen, wanting nothing more than to go back on Google Maps to make sure the man was still there. Back then, PCs took a very long time to load. Suddenly, I heard the doorknob to my front door start jiggling. I feared for the worst. Was that the man? I looked back at my computer, and it was still booting up. The jiggling stopped. Then, I heard the familiar cracking sound of my front door opening. My heart was racing in my chest, and my hands were trembling. I knew that the door to my room was locked, but if the man could get through the front door, he could easily get through the door to my room. Then, I heard my mom's voice calling out, "We're home." All the tension I had suddenly disappeared, and I raced downstairs to see my parents taking off their shoes at the front door. I frantically told them about what happened regarding the man, and they did not believe me. I practically dragged them to my room and opened up Google Maps Street View for our house, expecting to see the familiar jagged smile. However, the man was not there. I zoomed in and out all over my house and could not find no trace of the man. I kept insisting that he was there, but my parents never believed me. They said that even if the man was there was no way it could have happened in real time since the photos were taken months ago. The next day, I told my friends the story at lunchtime, and while it scared them for a moment, they eventually forgot about the story. I never forgot about what happened that night. The memory of the man's crooked smile and bulging eyes come back to me whenever I consider opening up Street View on Google Maps. So now, whenever someone asks me why I never use Street View, I simply tell them that I would rather see things with my own eyes than trust whatever image is on the screen. I'm a professional trail guide, living and working in Japan. I moved out here from my native Australia several years ago for work. My job is pretty damn cool, but can be a tad creepy from time to time. One forest I work in is a hotspot for suicides. Sometimes the Japanese authorities hire me to help them find bodies of people that have wandered too far from the path. Generally, these people never wanted to be found if they ventured too far though. Because of this, the locals say demons lurk within the massive sea of trees. Lost souls who have been tricked and are now unable to escape the endless maze. I believed none of the tall tales that locals make up about it until yesterday, when I found a strange tiny diary in a plastic bag washed up along a stream. The contents are extremely disturbing and are making me question my ongoing employment. I need to share this in order to preserve my own sanity. The entry reads as follows. Okiagara, or the Sea of Trees, is a forest in Japan that rests at the base of Mount Fuji. It is a Japanese national park that brings in thousands of tourists every year. It is also known as Suicide Forest because people have been ending their lives there for hundreds of years. Not everyone who comes here is a tourist though. Many of those who come to this place seek a permanent solution to their temporary problems, including myself. It's a cursed place that serves to draw in the miserable and the damned in droves. The local Japanese say that ghosts of Yurei prowl the forest, hoping to lead those who go there of the path and to their demise. My life had been just too overwhelming. To cope with the death of my parents, I was working 80-hour weeks. This was partially to avoid the fact that my wife was banging another guy in our bed. The long hours served as the only way to remedy the crushing debt that buried me and prevented me from escaping my desperate home life. There really was no way out for me. I had no friends, nowhere to go. I could either go home, listening to my wife get pounded, or I could deal with the purgatory of paperwork at my job. Unfortunately, it was a simple choice. One morning, I woke up after the night of sleeping in my cold garage and decided that I had enough. I was going to do the world a favor and off myself. However, I was afraid. I have always been a coward. After extensive research of the easiest way to die was inconclusive, I decided that the only thing I could control was the venue in which I died. I had always wanted to visit Japan, and deep down inside, I could hope that the long journey would give me the time to change my mind. Unfortunately, my mind remained unchanged, and within the week, I found myself on a jet heading to Tokyo. My mind raced at this point. I still didn't know how I would do it. Not having the means to get sleeping pills, knowing that guns are unheard of in Japan, and being too much of a coward to use a knife, I decided on hanging. I figured it would be the most economical way to die. Maybe not the most pleasant, but who cares? Someone as pathetic as I didn't deserve a good death. Once I arrived in the country, the first order of business was to buy a sturdy bit of rope while I was still in the city. Now all I had to do was locate a solid tree. This wouldn't be hard, considering the venue I had chosen for my demise. Next, I had to find transportation to the forest. This was by far the hardest part, considering that I know no Japanese whatsoever, and many of the locals who spoke a sliver of English refused to take me once they realized I had no camping gear. Unable to find direct transportation, I had to alter my plans. After nearly an entire day of searching, I secured transportation on a rickety old bus to Kawaguchiko Hotel, which is located right off the trailhead that leads into Okigahara. I spent the bus ride planning exactly how I would spend the last few hours of life that I still had. And ultimately, I decided I would make it fast. I would follow the trail for approximately a mile and then leave the trail for another mile. This left me little time to change my mind and meant that they would most likely never find my corpse. After being dropped off, I saw how vast the forest truly was. It was around noon, local time, but the shadows cast by the forest seemed to block out all light from around it. There was also an engulfing feeling of emptiness creeping from the depths of the woods. But as I made my way into the forest, I saw dozens of signs that had a variation of the same message. Think about your family, or get help. Death isn't the answer. I got chills shortly after walking in. It's as if the temperature drops by 20 degrees when you enter the forest. Some say this is because of the trapped spirits who left the path and can't find their way out, but I attributed it to the thick canopy cover of the trees. More of the signs I mentioned earlier lined the trail. They bore messages that said never to leave the trail. Locals here know that the only people who leave the trail are those who wish to die. As a result, tourists stick to the well-mapped paths. I continued to follow the trail. As I pressed on deeper into the woods, sadness overwhelmed me. It was as if I was standing in a black hole where no light could reach me. I knew that it was time to leave the trail. To my surprise, immediately upon leaving the trail, I heard soft, melodic whispers. I turned back and took one last look at the trail for just a moment before pressing on. The soothing voices beckoned me deeper into the forest. Continuing through the sea of trees, the feeling of sadness and emptiness dissipated. I was no longer chilly. Instead, the cool breeze felt great. The leaves crunched under my boots. I could hear the sound of water flowing in a small creek, and the sweet whispers continued to draw me in. As the orange sunset below the trees, I found the forest to be peaceful. Forgetting about all my problems at home, I knew that I wanted to stay here for eternity, shrouded and protected by the forest. After what felt like an hour of wandering and taking in the breathtaking sights, I found a tall tree in a small clearing. It was dusk by this point, and I knew that this meant that the sun had set on me. It was time. I took a seat at the base of the tree and began tying the rope that I had bought in Tokyo into a tight noose. Next, I found a large rock that I could roll over to the tree. After doing this, I threw my noose over a low branch near the rock and secured it. Stepping up onto the rock and placing my head through the noose like a necklace was the surest thing I have ever done. It erased all my doubts and every mortal fear of death that I had. I knew that I was safe here. Finally, I stepped down. There was no peaceful ending like I anticipated. Instead, the world went dark, and the forest turned cold once again. Hundreds of once sweet voices began screaming simultaneously, wailing in despair. They told me I was a failure, that I deserved my fate, and how I would never find my way out of this place. They tricked me. I fought with all my strength against the rope tied around my neck. As I thrashed and twisted violently, I saw a pale, thin woman with black hair and a white kimono sauntering towards me. My vision faded in and out, and I knew that I was dying. Each time this happened, she got closer, until finally, she placed her icy hands around my neck as she let out a haunting wail. I pulled at the noose and desperately tried to alleviate pressure on my neck, but it was no use. The ghostly woman grabbed me and was pulling me downwards, creating even more force on my throat. Everything went dark until suddenly I found myself in excruciating pain on the cold forest floor. I looked up and saw that the rope had snapped. The woman in white was no longer there, but I was alone in the forest. It was frigid and dark as I made my way to my feet and scrambled to find the trail. I searched and searched for hours to no avail. Afraid and alone in the forest, I gave up hope yet again. At one point, I saw one of the telltale yellow signs and sprinted towards it, only to run full force into a hanged man as he dangled limply from the tree. The force of the impact caused the corpse to plummet from the tree and crash into the ground. As this happened, I made my way to my feet to run the opposite direction, but found myself pulled to the ground by a cold, dead hand. Mouth agape, the decaying man clawed my leg and tried to climb my body. In response to this, I delivered a swift, forceful kick to his face that allowed me to climb to my feet and begin running. I kept running for hours. The entire time I heard him screaming and running right behind me. I came to Okigahara to die, but now I wasn't going to allow that to happen. I knew that I would make it away from that horrific place. Finally, after hours of running, the footsteps behind me died out and I saw a light. There appeared to be a woman holding a candle, walking through the forest. I desperately wanted to run to her, but I knew that she had to be one of the ghosts I had encountered earlier. Instead, I made my way towards the only thing I could still see from where I was at, the mountain. I continued to move through the forest at breakneck speed, hoping that I could make it to the mountain and work my way around the edge until I found civilization. But that never happened. Currently, I'm somewhere in a system of caves. My legs are badly broken after a fall, and I fear that I will not be able to crawl to safety because I am so depleted. I've been in the forest for what feels like days. I'm not even sure if I'm alive anymore. What if I'm one of them? They're here. I can hear hundreds of whispering voices. They're in here with me. I keep drifting in and out of consciousness, and each time I fall asleep, I feel Yuri's pale, icy hands pulling me into damnation. I'm throwing this diary into a small stream that is running next to me in hopes that someone finds it. If someone finds this diary, please recover my body. I don't want to be like them, doomed to wander this forsaken place forever. When I was 13, my family was murdered. The killer went from room to room in my home, slaughtering my family in the early hours of a Sunday morning in June of 2001. My father was killed first, neck sliced wide and deep as he drank his first cup of coffee. My sister was next. a pillow over her face as she lay sleeping in her room. The bed and the floor were covered in bloody feathers by the time the knife was done turning her head into a crimson ruin. My mother died in the shower, a jagged piece of metal pipe being rammed through the shower curtain in her torso with enough force that she was left pinned to the fair tile wall like a butterfly. I was away at band camp that summer and wasn't due to be home for another week. I was mopping up water in the boys' bathroom when I saw my aunt at the door, eyes red-rimmed and voice trembling, as she told me something had happened and I needed to go with her. I knew right away it was something terrible, but as she told me the barest of versions of what had happened, that someone had come into our home and murdered my family, I felt myself disconnecting from everything, including her words. The next few days were just a red haze of shock and pain, and my first clear memories are over a month after I moved in with my Aunt Judith and her husband Ernie. They were good to me. I struggled with school and friends for years afterward, but they were always patient and kind, never failing to give me a second and third chances until I ran out of excuses for punishing them and hating myself. They never found out who did it or why. My parents weren't wealthy or connected. They didn't have enemies or rivals that I knew of. And while it was always possible that the killings were just random, the precision of it all didn't seem like the work of a deranged spree killer. In high school, I spent years cultivating the theory that it was a local serial killer, but that was mainly fueled by desperation and bad internet research. I wanted to catch their killer, but even more than that, I wanted to understand why it had happened. Maybe they'd never give an answer, but if I could at least put a face and a name to the person that killed my life, it'd be a start. But that never came. I wound up going to an art school for college, and between work, classes, and all the trappings that come with becoming an adult, my obsession began to fade. I'm ashamed to say it, but there are days now I don't even think about the family that was taken from me. I work at an animation studio in the restoration department. My job is to repair and restore old damaged footage for clients, and when possible, transfer the restored version to a digital format for both viewing and archival purposes. A lot of people hate that kind of work. It's tedious. And while it makes a lot of money for the company, it's not flashy like working on new digital animation or special effects. But me, I love it. I get to take care of things that people once cared about and spent a lot of time on, things that might otherwise rot away or be lost, and I get to heal them, make them new and alive again. Some people just see them as dumb cartoons, but I disagree. And if you asked me last week, I'd have said there wasn't a better job in the whole world. The package was sitting on my desk last Thursday. Brown paper wrapped around what looked like the shape of a small film reel and tied with a piece of gray string. It was strange, but only a little. While most of our work we did was for companies looking to redistribute old assets they owned or had acquired on disc or streaming. Occasionally, a private owner with deep pockets would commission us to restore something they found in their grandparents' attic or something. It didn't make any difference to me where it came from. It was something new and mysterious, a potential new challenge or the opportunity to see something few had ever seen before, at least not for a very long time. Setting down my coffee, I carefully opened the package and pulled out the reel of film. I looked for some kind of note or instructions, but there was none. That was strange. I called up to the admin department, but they didn't know what I was talking about at first. When they called back a few minutes later, the woman just said it was apparently a personal package dropped off for you, not anything for a client. There was a disapproving edge to her voice, but I ignored it, thanking her and hanging up before turning back to the film. It looked to be well preserved, no tears or cracks, and spot checking a few frames showed no obvious signs of color shift or fading. It was just some kind of strange cartoon with an odd figure holding various sinister weapons. I didn't know why, but my heart began to beat faster. Normally I would document and copy each frame before attempting to play an unknown film. It's too easy to miss imperfections that can cause damage when it run through a projector. But this wasn't a real job, and I'd seen just enough in those few frames that I wanted to watch the whole thing right away. So I locked the door to my office, thread the film into one of the 35mm projectors in the media room, and watched in horror at what began to play. The cartoon began without any title card or preamble. It simply showed an animated figure wearing a hooded sweatshirt or jacket entering into a house. There was no sound, but the movements of characters mimicked the fluid, exaggerated animations of characters in the 1920s and 30s. Legs like slinkies encased in jello propelled him creepily along as he snuck deeper into someone's home. The figure went to the kitchen first. There he found an unsuspected man sitting at the kitchen table, reading a book while sipping from a cup. The figure crept up behind him, waiting patiently, perhaps gleefully, until the man sat down his coffee. Then in one slow and fluid movement, he grasped the man's forehead and pulled it back while bringing a comically large straight razor across his neck. Cartoon blood sprayed out across the table into the far wall, but the figure and the camera were already on the move again. The cartoonishness, the crude nature of the animation should have made it easier to watch, but it didn't. The killer was still moving with exaggerated sneaking steps, but now his chest was heaving with exertion or excitement. As he moved to the back hall, I knew what was coming, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. The figure eased into my sister's bedroom. She was supposed to be going to college in the fall, and after that, to veterinarian school. She was sweet and smart and beautiful, and I loved her so much. On the film, the girl's body was spasming as the killer stabbed the pillow he'd pressed over her face again and again. When he was done, he moved on to the master bedroom and the bathroom beyond. Blue clouds of steam boiled out from behind the shakily twitching shower curtain as the figure gestured toward the camera as though telling the audience to wait a moment or keep quiet so they didn't alert his prey. Partially unzipping his sweatshirt, he produced a long piece of pipe with a sinister edge on one end. In real life, hiding something so large would have been impossible, but in the cartoon logic of the film, I barely registered it before all thought was driven from me. As he drove the pipe through the curtain and into my mother, drawn lines of blood shot across the wall and down into the tub while a small, pale hand twitched pitifully from beyond the edge of the curtain. I was gripping my knees so hard my hands ached, but I couldn't look away. When the screen went blank, I let out my held breath, thinking it was finally over. My mind started racing. Who would have sent it to me? The killer? After all this time? Someone else? Someone playing a sick prank by taking what happened to my family and turning it into a cartoon? Neither seemed to make much sense, but I needed it to. The film flared back to life. It was in a darkened room that had been drawn with more care and detail than the scenes that had preceded it. In the center of the frame was a pool of moonlight from a nearby window, and in that glow, a cartoon boy slept a troubled sleep. It was clear from the flowered comforter and the ornate porcelain lamps on the bedside tables that this wasn't a little boy's room. It was a guest room meant more for decoration than company, and it had been hastily prepared in the face of some unexpected calamity. I recognized that room. It had been my bedroom until I went to college, but it hadn't been decorated like that after that first night. This was the first night I was with them, the night after my family was killed. I jumped as the hooded figure suddenly appeared from the dark at the moon glow's edge. He leaned over the cartoon boy with almost theatrical malevolence, and for a moment, I expected him to speak or perhaps even kill the past cartoon version of me. Instead, A dark tongue snaked out from the shadows of his hood, trailing up the side of the cartoon boy's face and ruffling his hair. Where the tongue had traveled, there was now a deep red mark left in its wake. The killer raised up, his shoulders shaking silently in what might have been laughter, and then the film went dark. As it did, bright wet pain seared across the side of my face and up into my scalp. Letting out a scream, I ran to the bathroom to wash my face. There must have been something on that film, or some contaminant from somewhere, and I was having a reaction. I needed to wash the area thoroughly and then check the mirror to see what. It was the mark from the cartoon. It blazed from the side of my face like a birthmark or old burn. But that wasn't possible. I didn't have any burns or birthmarks. Never had, that I knew of. I squirted soap into my hand and feverishly scrubbed at the spot. It didn't hurt anymore, but I could quickly feel the skin growing raw under my attack. Forcing myself to stop, I rinsed off the soap and put a cold, damp paper towel against the mark. Maybe it was just a rash and would go away. I stumbled back into the other room to find that the screen was still dark, though the reel continued to turn with no signal of running out of film. I was moving to switch off the projector when the connected speakers crackled to life. A single distorted phrase poured out of them like a cloudy poison before the machine died on its own. Be seeing you. I know you're frowning. The title is weird, I know. But if you could just give me a moment, I'll explain. I'll have to be fast though. I don't know how close they are. Essentially, I ordered myself on the dark web. I'm a drug user, I'll admit it. Weed is my usual go-to, but I buy that off my friend. If, however, I want to get something a little heavier, like acid or coke, I just order it off the dark web. It's surprisingly simple. A few clicks, some Bitcoin transfers, and then boom, I have acid in my P.O. box. But I'm also a curious guy. The dark web has always intrigued me. Up until a few days ago, I had only been on there to buy drugs off the sites some of my friends gave to me. But late one night, I was sober and at home, which was a rare thing for me. So, since I was bored, I decided to boot up my Tor browser and try to see what sort of fucked up shit I could find on the dark web. If you've ever been on the dark web, you'll know that you can't just search up red rooms or hitmen for hire and get results. No, you have to find links to these websites first. So I hopped back onto Google again to try and find some links to a messed up website. I know it's weird that I was actively searching for the worst, but as soon as I got on the dark web that night, I had a sense of morbid curiosity overcome me. Anyway, I spent a little while trying to find some links. Anything that I found though was either too tame for me, or the links didn't work. At this point, I was about ready to give up, and I wish I had. But in one final attempt, I clicked on Reddit, hopping onto r/deepweb. I didn't think I'd find anything, so I just scrolled through hot for about half an hour before sorting by new. Then, I found it. One simple text post titled, Slayer's Assassination and Life-Ruining Services. In the text box in the post was what seemed to be just a random assortment of numbers and letters. It took my tired brain a second to figure out what it was, but I realized pretty quickly. It was a link, presumably to a hitman website. So, I decided to paste a link into my dark web browser, and what do you know? It worked. But before I decided to go any further, I figured I should go back to the OP's profile to see if they have posted any other dark web links. However, when I went back to the post in question, OP's profile was deleted. Weird. Anyway, I reopened my dark web tab and hopped onto the site. Up along the top of the website was its name, Slayer's Assassination and Life-Ruining Services, and next to it, what looked to be a skull inside of a crosshair. I chuckled when I saw that. The site must be fake. Upon scrolling down, however, I was not disappointed. There was a paragraph of white text on a black background, and a small box to the right of the text that just said, "Place an order." The text was the main part though, as it took up most of the page. It read, "Slayer's Assassination and Life-Ruining Services offers everything from acid attack, crippling, blinding, castration, torture, rape, beatings, and good old death. We have the lowest prices out of any other company running similar services, and we are worldwide. We have a dedicated and experienced group of staff based all over the world. So if you need someone to be assassinated, or maybe you just want them scared for life, don't hesitate to contact us." Again, I laughed. This had to be satire, right? Hell, I was even tempted to order it on someone just to see what would happen. Ironically, I actually have a half-decent job, so I can afford to. Better not to risk it though, I thought to myself. I was about to close my computer and call it for a night when I heard a knock at the door. I live alone, so it was unusual to get visitors, especially so late at night, but when I opened my door, it was just my good buddy Mark, who also happened to be my weed plug. As I opened the door, he didn't hesitate to let himself in and shove a big baggie full of pot in my face. "This, dude, is the best shit I've had in a minute. We gotta try some." I couldn't say no. Cut to a couple hours later, it's early morning and Mark and I are chilling on my couch, both blazed as fuck. He suddenly decided to get up, and I assume he's going to get some leftover pizza, but he walks over to my desk and computer. "Slayer's Assassinations. Are you gonna kill someone or something?" he mutters. "What?" I reply. "Your computer, dude. It's got some hacker shit on it. It's the dark web, man. Don't fuck with it." At this point, I'm still on my couch, half asleep and not paying full attention. However, I sat up pretty fast when he said the words, "Hey man, let's order a hitman on you." I hopped up and walked over to my PC. Part of my brain was screaming no, what the fuck are you doing? But the majority of my brain, which was also the high part, was thinking about how funny it would be to order a hitman on myself. So I agree. I did make him get out of my chair though, because I didn't want him seeing what my credit card numbers were as I transferred some Bitcoin. At the end, after I wrote down all my personal details, like my address, age, and even a photo, I had to select what I wanted to happen to me. I just selected plain old assassination, as it was actually cheaper than some of the other things. I could have paid an extra couple of grand to be beaten before my death, but even my high brain didn't want to splash the cash too much on my own death. God, this is ridiculous. Anyway, I placed the order and then replied to a confirmation email and boom, it was done. A couple of clicks and I had ordered myself on the dark web. Mark and I laughed about it for a while, but then he left about an hour later and I fell asleep not too long after. I woke up around 9 a.m., which meant I got at least 6 hours of sleep, even if it felt like I got 3. I got up and got out of bed, threw on some track pants and cotton shirt, and brewed myself a coffee before sitting down to play some games and just enjoy my Sunday. You can imagine how shocked I was when I saw that I had ordered my death the previous night. Even though I thought the site was bullshit, I still felt a pit open up in my stomach. Even when I'm high, I usually can make sensible decisions. I chuckled. Not like I could remember it anyway, but I guess Mark's new shit really was good. I would assume a normal human being would do something else, but I was still kind of out of it from the night before, so I just carried on with my day. I was a little more paranoid, sure, But as I said, I just assumed it was bullshit. I even laughed at the email I got from the website, saying that their hitman has been dispatched and was on its way. It was like ordering a package off Amazon. I was tempted to email back and ask for same-day delivery, but I didn't need to ask because that's exactly what I got. I didn't see it arrive, but around the time I started to cook myself a shitty dinner, I noticed a blacked-out sedan parked on the other side of the road from my house. I didn't live in a rural area, but there was a lot of trees and bushes between each of the houses on my street, so I would be surprised if any other house saw the car except for mine. At this point, I was freaking out. What if the sight was real? Even though I'm a big guy, I was freaking out. I don't own any weapons, aside from a slightly larger than average kitchen knife. Fuck it. I'm confronting it, I decided. I put on a hoodie and slid the knife into the front pocket before waltzing on out of my house and walking right up to the driver's side window of the vehicle. Even I was astonished at my own courage. Knocking on the window, nothing happened. It was rather anticlimactic. I was fully prepared to have to fight for my life, all because I did something really dumb while I was baked. But, like I said, nothing happened. I even put my head right up to the window, as if there was a reflection, to try and get a better look to see what's inside. I could barely see what was inside of the car, but all I could make out were 2 empty seats. No one was even inside. I had got all hyped up for nothing. I decided to wait out by the car for a bit, but after a half hour or so, I was hungry and had to go back inside and take my dinner out of the oven. I swear, it was only a minute between me going inside to take my dinner out of the oven and looking back out of the window, and the car being gone. I didn't even hear it go. Guess I'm eating my dinner with all my curtains closed and doors locked, I muttered to myself. I had just started to calm down when the power shut off. It was sunny outside, and coupled with the car, I now knew this was the real deal. I had signed my own death warrant. I ran into my upstairs bedroom and locked the door, and then hid under the bed. I couldn't call the cops. What would I say? Oh yes, hello sir. Turns out while I was super high, I paid $5,000 for some anonymous hitman to kill me, and now he's arrived. Send an officer ASAP, please and thank you. So I just stayed hiding under my bed, and I still am now. I've been here for an hour now writing this. Think of this as my epitaph. I know I'm screwed. Just a minute ago, I heard my back door slowly creak open. This piece of writing may seem humorous to you, the reader, but in reality, as you read this, I'm under my bed praying to a God that lost all faith in me years ago to spare me, to let me go. But I know that won't happen. My bedroom door just opened and I can see a big pair of black boots. I don't even know where to start. I can hardly think straight, have lost all my appetite, can't sleep, not with what I know now. I hope that anyone who sees this can learn from my mistake before it's too late. What started as mere curiosity has ruined my life. I am a computer science major and have loved computers from a young age. The ability to create such powerful programs and interfaces through the mere utilization of code has always amazed and fascinated me. It's 8 p.m. I'm at the local high school. I teach an after-school intro to programming class every weekend. Not a bad job. $15 an hour is not too shabby, and most of the students who take my class are reasonably intelligent and disciplined. As my class was coming to a close, one of my students motioned me to come over. Sir, what is this? I glanced at his screen as he moved his mouse over an application saved to his desktop entitled Tor. It's just a web browser, like Windows or Chrome, except it allows the user to search the web anonymously and is highly encrypted, meaning it is nearly impossible to trace or record any internet activity. I explained. He stared hard at the application for a moment, like he was pondering something. So nothing I do on tour can be tracked back to me? Could I access the deep web on something like this? I suppose you could access most anything on it, I replied frankly, before walking back to the front of the class. Thank you for your time today, class. I hope you all learned something new about using JavaScript on web platforms. Tomorrow I look forward to seeing all your complete HTML projects. Enjoy your evening. Class is dismissed. Like every other day, I drove straight home, watched Netflix for an hour, then went straight to bed. Needless to say, I didn't have the greatest social life. The next day is when things started to get weird. When I showed up to class 15 minutes early to prepare, I found that same boy sitting outside waiting. "What are you doing here so early?" I asked, genuinely perplexed. He looked at me straight in the eye, and I felt immediately that something was wrong. There's something I need to show you," he stammered. I felt uneasy and confused. This behavior was unlike him. He hardly ever talked in class. With the exception of an occasional question, much less showed emotion. I downloaded Tor on my computer last night after I got home. I was curious and just wanted to check it out, he said uneasily. But when I woke up in the morning, I noticed I received several anonymous messages. He pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and handed it to me. My eyes were immediately widened. "Stop now. We know who you are. We know all about you. Stop what you are doing. This is your only warning. We are watching you." There was no phone number attached. It just said, "Private caller." Probably just a prank text, I reasoned. "Do you think this could be related to Tor?" he asked nervously. "Nah, I doubt it. The shadiest stuff that ever happens here is the buying and selling of illegal weapons, drugs, and stuff like that. I've never heard of anyone getting stalked from using it. Plus, there's no way they could get your phone number, especially when you're using an encrypted browser," I declared, trying my best to sound confident. "Wait, about what time did you use Tor last night?" "Like 9:30, right before I went to bed." "And what time did you get those texts?" 9:41, he said, blinking slowly. "I'm not gonna lie, that's really weird. Just don't use Tor tonight and see what happens." "I won't. I definitely won't. Thank you for your reassurance." He smiled genuinely and appeared to have finally calmed down. "Have a seat. Class will start shortly." The rest of the day went more or less as usual. The students presented the websites they had created, and I assessed and critiqued them. Class ended, and I went straight home as I did every other day. This night, however, I didn't watch Netflix. I downloaded Tor. I felt I had no other choice. I had to get to the bottom of this. It was my moral duty. If anyone was qualified to research this browser, I was. I knew everything from how to encrypt my VPN from any server to my computer, hacking, and everything in between. Download complete. My screen read. Right before I could dive in, I felt a wave of uneasiness hit me. As much as I hated to admit it, what happened to my student was really creepy, especially the fact that his usage of Tor and the appearance of those weird messages occurred in the matter of minutes. I'll hold off until tomorrow, I reasoned, just to be sure. He wasn't at class the next day, or the next. I learned from the local news he had gone missing. He has yet to be found. It can't be a coincidence anymore. It must be related to Tor. Before I could contact authorities, I received a text message. "We know what you know. Say a word and you're next. We are watching you." I'm posting through this botnet, so don't even think about getting cute and trying to find me. I've got enough trouble with people finding me as it is. It all started a few months ago, when I found a good source of speed on a deep web marketplace I won't name. I live in a town so small and bland that even the local high school kids don't bother selling drugs. It's boring as sin here, which is one of the reasons I started ordering speed online in the first place. I was always very cautious. I tumbled my bitcoins carefully and ensured that every transaction was well encrypted. Yes, before you even ask, the proxies I used were fully configured and trustworthy ones. It wasn't the technology that failed me at all. Actually, it was a single mistake in judgment. To a single trusted seller, I gave my real physical address. At first, I was only getting small packages for my personal use, so it was easy to have them delivered to the house of an old woman who lived nearby. Her live-in nurse constantly checked the mail very late in the day, so there was never much of an issue in retrieving the speed before it was noticed. But my habit grew, and I began to introduce my close friends to the drug. So eventually, I contacted my seller about ordering much larger quantities, enough for me to sell locally. We began to work like business partners in a supply chain, and I was placing substantial orders regularly. The speed originally came to me in small padded envelopes, but now it would have to be shipped in a large cardboard box. The envelopes always fit easily inside a mailbox, but a box like this would have to be delivered to the front door. I couldn't have the mailman walking up to a stranger's driveway to ring the doorbell, so I requested that the speed started being directly sent to me. I knew by this point that the seller was legitimate and a reliable source, so trusting him with my address just seemed safer than the alternative. We had become something like casual friends by this point, and began to do things together like frequent the same deep web communities and chat if we were both online. My seller was wickedly funny sometimes, and really seemed to be a nice guy. I guess that's part of why I trusted him. But then again, it's not his fault about what happened. Recently though, I got a totally unsatisfactory shipment. The pressed pills looked right at first, but tasted like bitter flour and were far too brittle. They produced no high at all. I had been stiffed, and when I checked the marketplace, I found that my seller's account had been closed out. He left no message to explain it. I assumed that he just ripped me off, but it also didn't seem like something he would do. I wondered if I misjudged him. Yesterday, I noticed that one of his accounts was actively posting on one of the small community forums. I contacted him immediately in a private message and asked whether he knew that this last batch was complete bunk. It took about 25 minutes before I got any response, but suddenly, the messages began pouring in. The person you're trying to contact has passed away. Sorry. 3 whole weeks with no visitors. Isn't that funny? He had almost no food in his house when I killed him, so I didn't even need to clear out the fridge to store his meat. I've been poking around his computer too. I wrote back and accused him of taking a weird joke too far. I told him that he at least owed me an explanation for the last shipment. You never smelled bone meal? Did you ever have a garden as a kid or anything? There was a brief pause, and then a short volley of messages appeared before I could form my response. You know, you actually don't live too far away from where I am now. Isn't that something? Well, be seeing you. What do you think? It's probably just a scheme to scare me off, right?